Very nice to see you, sir.
Nice to be here. It's
And
a
you know
pleasure.
what? I love your book, President Carter. It's dense. When I first got it, I thought, oh, brother, am I going to be able to read all this? But it's riveting. It's a fascinating piece of history.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know what? And I think what caught me most of all is one of the first things I read in which was that President Carter, who was a U.S. president for one term, was a more consequential president than he's given credit for. Why did you write that?
One of the reasons, Greta, that I've got good reviews from the book is because it's candid and honest about our mistakes. But those mistakes have obscured the achievements. And just very quickly, in domestic affairs, the energy security the United States enjoys today rests significantly on the foundation of 3 energy bills we passed. He was a great environmental president, double the size of the national park system that Theodore Roosevelt created. All the ethics legislation in an ethically challenged Washington came from the Carter administration after Watergate. He created the modern vice presidency with Walter Mondale, making it a real partner. He deregulated all modes of transportation, rail, bus, air,
civil and
especially important for us as consumers. There wouldn't be the FedExes and the UPS cargoes, there wouldn't be the JetBlues and the Southwests if we hadn't ended regulation. And we even did it in your field, in telecommunications. We began to end the regulations in telecommunications, which inaugurated the whole cable era. In foreign affairs, Camp David and the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty are, I think, the greatest single act of personal diplomacy of any president in American history, more than Woodrow Wilson. In the Paris Peace Accords after World War I, we put human rights at the center of our foreign policy and applied it to both the military dictators in Latin America and to the Soviet Union. We recognized for the first time China. Nixon and Kissinger deserve all the credit for the opening, but we applied the actual diplomatic imprimatur to China. We applied hard power to the Soviet Union. Again, Ronald Reagan deserves all the credit for the military buildup. But Greta, all the military systems he began, the MX mobile missile, the intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, the cruise missile, the stealth bomber, all of those were ours. And even his conservative critics will say that his greatest hour was in dealing with the Afghan invasion by the Soviet Union, where we embargoed grain 4 weeks before the Iowa primaries. We armed the Mujahideen. We boycotted the Olympics in Moscow, remembering in '36 that we didn't do that in Berlin, and draft registration and much more. So all of these were major accomplishments, and they were overshadowed by the real problems I talk about: Iran, inflation, inter-party warfare, and inexperience. I call them the 4 I's.
Did you know that he was consequential of that magnitude before you wrote the book? Because I must admit, when I got the book, because I grew up during President Carter's days when he was president, I was a voter at the time and still am a voter. And you know, I never thought of him as consequential. Then I read your book, and you go through these litany of things, and I go, oh yeah, that, I forgot about that, I forgot about that. But when you were working for him, did you know he was that consequential? Because he only did 1 term.
I think that the overwhelming loss we suffered at the hands of Ronald Reagan in 1980, perhaps the greatest loss by an incumbent president of any in American history, only one, Greta, 6 states in the District of Columbia. Even for me working inside, when you're there in the hothouse, you don't have the perspective, and much of what we accomplished really was seen after the fact. So let me give you one example. Inflation, which was our Achilles heel domestically. We inherited high inflation of that whole decade of the 70s from Nixon and Ford, and it got worse in our administration. And Carter called us in July of 1979 and said, look, I've tried everything. 2 anti-inflation czars, 5 anti-inflation speeches, voluntary wage and price guidelines, procurement sanctions, cutting domestic spending to satisfy the markets and alienating the liberal wing of my party. I'm going to do something that will probably risk my election. I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, knowing in advance, and I describe it in a book, in a celebrated meeting, Volcker, Greta, was completely honest. He said, look, if you appoint me, you have to know the political consequences. I'm going to tighten the money supply. It's going to cause interest rates and unemployment to go up. I'm going to squeeze inflation out of the system the hard way. And it worked, but not in time for it to benefit us. And that's emblematic of so much of what we did and what only became obvious, even to me, after the fact. Inflation dropped like a rock. When? At the end of the first year of the Reagan administration, not in time for our reelection. So many of the things I've described, even to myself, when you're in that fray with all the competing interests and the pressures, it's only when you step back and look at it from the perspective of time that you appreciate how much was done.
Well, looking through it, and you remind me of all the things that he did, and I don't mean to harp on something that wasn't a particular success, but naturally one of the biggest events of his presidency was at least I think the nation was surprised what happened in Iran. It became, they had the revolution. Yes. Did you see that coming?
No, and that's the problem, and I'm absolutely brutally honest in the several chapters on Iran. I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the Iranian Revolution and the exile of the Shah any more than it would be fair, Greta, to blame Dwight Eisenhower as president in 1959 for the Castro Revolution 90 miles from our shore or for the overthrow of Mubarak in the Obama administration. However, I call it the single greatest intelligence failure in American history. The CIA, which had reinstalled the Shah in 21-year-old, every president had made him our favorite in the region, got all of our most sophisticated arms, and yet they didn't know under Carter that his domestic support had totally eroded. It was resting on quicksand. They didn't understand, and this is amazing, that for 5 years, Greta, our principal ally, was getting secret treatments for an incurable form of cancer. They didn't realize that Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Islamic radical revolution, that those cassettes he was sending back to Iran, we knew he was sending them, but didn't appreciate the inflammatory nature of the cassettes. And then Carter makes a series of drastic mistakes. What to do about the hostages? This is not a book which could be entitled If He Only Listened to Me, but this is one case where I wish he had listened to me and to our National Security Advisor, Brzezinski. We recommended, Greta, immediate military action when the hostages were taken. Not bombing Tehran, but blockading or mining the harbors, out of which almost all Iranian oil came, and choking the economy to show Khomeini he wouldn't survive if he didn't let them loose. Then he makes another mistake. To show that he's concentrating solely on getting the hostages out, he holds himself up in the White House, cancels foreign trips, cancels campaigning in the Democratic primary against Kennedy. He made himself the hostage and gave Khomeini more leverage. And in your profession, that's where Ted Koppel and Nightline started. That's where Walter Cronkite, the dean of news reporting, would end every broadcast, day 103, day 207, day 305 of the hostage crisis. It was incredibly debilitating for 444 humiliating days. He told the hostage families, my number one priority is to get your loved ones out safe and sound, and he did, but at enormous reputational cost to the country and political cost to him. And then the straw that broke the camel's back was the failed rescue effort, Desert One. And here I think I break some new ground, because the common wisdom, Greta, is it was Carter being weak again, not in effect having enough helicopters. The military wanted 6 helicopters. Carter added 2 more, 8, as a backup. The reason why Desert One failed, it was overly complex. We had unexpected windstorms, but the major problem was there was no coordinated command between the 4 military services involved. We created it afterward, but there was no joint command. So remarkably, there literally was no practice of the entire effort by all 4 services before we got into Desert One. And so when one of the helicopter rotors struck the C-130 cargo plane full of fuel to give the helicopters the fuel to go into Tehran for the rescue, and it went up in flames with 8 servicemen killed, it really was, in many ways, the end of the administration. People had simply concluded at the end of the day, if a person can't get our hostages out of what was viewed as a second or third-rate power, he doesn't deserve to be reelected. So it's a very harsh judgment, but it's one, again, I'm very candid about.
How do you think, if you were president, you would have handled the Iran deal, the nuclear deal?
Well, I know I've been the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Iran Task Force for 6 years. I've met with Foreign Minister Zarif from Iran, who is the nuclear negotiator. I think the way I would have handled it, I think the way Carter would have handled it, is the following. keep the nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, because it drastically limits Iran's capacity to go nuclear for at least a decade, but impose tough sanctions, even tougher sanctions, on their other activities, supporting terrorism, their missile program, their human rights violations, but separate out the JCPOA. You know, Jimmy Carter was a Naval Academy graduate. He was also a nuclear engineer. He was in Hyman Rickover's nuclear navy, almost lost his life on ship. He understood nuclear energy, he understood nuclear submarines, and his great passion, beside peace in the Middle East, which he accomplished, was non-proliferation. That's why he put so much emphasis on what we called SALT II, the nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union. And so for Iran, I'm sure he would have felt very strongly that limiting their capacity for nuclear weapons was absolutely crucial, but he would have kept that agreement. He would have kept it because, again, it limited their capacity in the future to go nuclear, and because we had the so-called P5+1, all the members of the National Security Council and Germany supporting it. He would not have wanted to unilaterally pull out.
When the Panama Canal was also a big deal during his presidency, and he got a lot of flack from the far right because the far right didn't want him to give up the Panama Canal. I remember hearing things, we bought it, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours on the Panama Canal. But eventually, I mean, it was during President Carter that we began to turn over to Panama. What do you think has been the impact of that on all Latin America?
It's a great question. First of all, Rosalind, his first lady, was in some respects a better politician than he was, and she told him, Jimmy, wait for the second term. This is too electric a political issue. He said, suppose there's not a second term. He felt very strongly the need to build a new relationship of equality with Latin America. That's what the Human Rights Program with Latin America against pro-American, anti-communist military dictators who had imprisoned thousands of prisoners. We got the whole democratic movement started, released thousands of prisoners. But on Panama, 80% of the public when we started was against it. It was our canal. What were we doing handing it back? And he felt that to show Latin America that it was a new day, we had to end this vestige of colonialism. There was a war room that his chief of staff manned. He talked to every one of the 100 senators. And there were two who were decisive. One who was physically very small in stature, but a giant of a man, the Republican leader from the Senate, Howard Baker of Tennessee, knowing, Greta, that it would mean he would never be the Republican nominee for president, felt it was the right thing to do. Can you imagine that today? And perhaps the most unlikely vote was Senator Hayakawa, who coined the very phrase you mentioned, it's our canal, we stole it fair and square. Mondale, as vice president, puts Hayakawa on with Carter. Carter says, Senator, what can I do to get your vote? Don't talk about the canal. What I want is to meet you every 2 weeks to share my wisdom. And Carter says, oh, Senator, only every 2 weeks? Flattered he voted for the canal. Carter never saw him again. But the fact is, turning over that canal was symbolically very important. It's been run without any incident. And Greta, we have to go back to that era. There were guerrilla fights in the canal zone. The Panamanians would not have tolerated it anymore. 3 presidents had unsuccessfully tried to tackle it. It was too politically hot. Carter realized it was unsustainable. It was a vestige of a colonial past. And now it has really inaugurated a new movement in Latin America with a whole body of Democrats and Democratic elections. So they've now put a second sea-level canal in. It's been a wonderful sign of cooperation. And he went down for the final year 2000, for the final turnover. We built in a very long transition so that we could be sure they had the technical and political capacity to run it. It's been a great success, as has been our Latin American policy in general.
And of course, he left a big footprint in the Middle East. But you know, I guess what's so fascinating to me is that he only had 4 years, and we tend to talk more about his post-presidency because he retired at a relatively young man, and he's been helping all over the world, helping people. He's been monitors in elections. He's been a very active post-president.
Yes, and I wanted to write this book because I wanted to take him out of the mode of being the most admired former president and let people shine the light on the presidency. Mistakes and all. Again, it's not a book that could have been, it's my mistakes and it's his advisor as well. It's not a book that could have been named if he'd only listened to me. But I wanted to give a complete assessment, the mistakes and the failures for sure, but also the successes that are not appreciated. And I'm not nominating him in this book for a place on Mount Rushmore, but I do believe, Greta, literally, that he belongs in the foothills of Mount Rushmore with other presidents who have made great contributions to a better country and a better world. So, yes, he's been a great former president. I wanted people to understand that he was a consequential 39th president as well. One other thing that would perhaps be useful to mention. Here's a Southern president from the deepest part of the Deep South who grows up in a segregated era. He appoints more women and more minorities to federal judgeships and to senior administration positions than all 38 presidents before him put together. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said she'd never be on the Supreme Court had he not opened judgeships to women and appointed her to the Court of Appeals. We supported affirmative action, and we saved New York City from bankruptcy, created the Department of Education, saved Chrysler from bankruptcy. All of these things are simply not recognized. So yes, he's a terrific former president, but he also was a consequential and important president.
In reading your book, and the thing that struck me is that he would probably have been a two-term president if he'd played politics more. He didn't seem to be, from how you write, he seemed at least portrayed as he wanted to do what he thought was the right thing. Whether it turned out to be something that was not a good idea, but at least try to do the right thing. But he didn't play politics, which is the way you get reelected.
Well, predictably, because of your own background as a great journalist, you put your finger on the prime problem. It was his strength and his weakness. He was a ferocious campaigner 100 days before the Iowa caucuses. He did what it took to get elected, but he believed that once you got into the White House, you did the right thing. And that was a strength because it meant he could take on Panama, he could take on the Middle East, he could take on energy, which were all political losers. But it was also a weakness because he failed to recognize the president's not only the commander-in-chief, he's the politician-in-chief. He's got to nurture his political base, which President Trump does every day. He's got to keep his party together behind him in good times and in bad. And he's got to make the kind of compromises. He was very moralistic. We won half a loaf many times. In fact, 2 independent surveys showed we've won 70% of all of our major legislation. But he asked for so much that when we got half a loaf, it looked like a defeat instead of a victory. So it was a great strength, but a great weakness.
And I always think it's a wonderful statement about the United States, is that even after losing his first term, he gets in the car with the incoming president of the United States, and we have a peaceful transfer of power. He had just lost for another term, yet he rides up to Capitol Hill to swear in the next president.
And waits expectedly, hoping that the hostages will be released before his term technically ends, and Khomeini wouldn't even grant him that. He releases the hostages 1 minute after Reagan is inaugurated. But didn't
Reagan then let him go meet the hostages?
And an act of great generosity, Reagan gave him Air Force One to meet the hostages in Germany. But here's a good example of the character of Carter. We overwhelmingly are defeated, one of the great defeats of any incumbent president. He says to us, Greta, the day afterward, get your chins off the ground. We're going to make this the best transition out ever. We get the Superfund chemical cleanup bill done. We reached the agreement to release the hostages, although Khomeini wouldn't let them actually out until afterward, but the agreement was done. The Alaska Lands Bill, doubling the size of our national park system, is done then. And he appoints Stephen Breyer, Kennedy's top aide, even after Kennedy had campaigned against him and split the party, to the First Circuit Court of Appeals.
Who later became a Supreme Court justice.
And Stephen Breyer will tell you he would never have been on the Supreme Court had Carter not done that. He turned the other cheek, knowing that Kennedy had asked him, and still felt, because what Stephen had done to help us on airline deregulation, being a great Harvard Law School professor, he'd be a great judge, and then wanted to become, and is, a great justice.
Well, you're absolutely right. He was a consequential president, and I regret that I didn't even realize it till I read your book. You know, I had thought about it, and you know, I appreciate the book.
Well, that's why I hope more people will read it, because it also tells the era of the 1970s, Greta. This was a time when the post-World War II consensus began to evaporate, with our first loss in Vietnam, with high inflation, with urban riots. It was a time of a whole new set of political movements which we barely recognized at the time. The environmental movement, the consumer movement, the women's rights movement, which has now morphed into #MeToo, the Black Power movement, which has morphed into Black Lives Matter, and also the beginning of what is a huge political force today, the Christian evangelical movement, started by Jerry Falwell, who in 1980 said of Carter, probably the most religious president we've ever had. He's not a real Baptist, and he's harboring homosexuals on his staff. And what Ronald Reagan did very successfully is he married together that evangelical, newly politicized movement with Richard Nixon's so-called silent majority of dissatisfied blue-collar workers in the industrial Midwest, and that's the very coalition that is the base of Donald Trump's coalition today. It overwhelmed us in 1980, as it overwhelmed our candidate Hillary Clinton unexpectedly in 2016, and it remains the very vibrant base of our current president.
Well, it's a fascinating book. Thank you very much for joining us. It's President Carter, the White House years.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity,
Thank you.
Greta.